what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask that you join me by turning in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 18. If this is your first time here, we've been going through a series of teachings on the life of Abraham, and this particular chapter is like part 2 of what we talked about last week. And if you would, just turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 18. If you didn't bring your own Bible, there are Bibles around you in the chairs, and I'd ask you to turn to page 11 in one of the Bibles in the chairs, if you don't have your own, where you'll find the passage. We're going to read together verses 1 through 15, and then look at a couple of other passages as well. But Genesis chapter 18. Now, for those of you who weren't here last week, a little reminder of where we kind of left off. These chapters, chapters 17 and 18, are found right in the middle of this story of Abraham's life. And so at the very beginning, God calls Abraham out. He tells him to leave his country, his family, his people, and go to the place that God will show him, that he's going to make him a nation, that he's going to give him children, and that his children and their descendants are going to inherit the land. So there's this promise which Abraham grabs hold of by faith. And he begins to make this journey away from his country, his people, to the place where God would show him. And along the way, there is this sense of even doubt, maybe even despair, because Abraham and his wife are getting older. They're past the age of having children. And so although they've grabbed hold of these promises that God's given to them, there are these questions. What's going to happen? What's it going to look like? How can this possibly be? And they begin to take steps. And we also know the end of the story. At the end of the story, in fact, God has made good on all of his promises. There is a child. His name is Isaac. God has been true to his word. He's done everything he promised. But there's this place between the beginning, where God lays out these promises, and the end when they're fulfilled. Maybe we'll call it the land between, where Abraham now is. And right in the middle of that, in chapter 17, God shows up and he makes this incredible promise, I will be your God. Which we said, as Abraham internalized this, he had kind of this message that we talked about last week, through Jesus Christ, or in Jesus Christ, I belong to him. Which is this powerful message, like, if I belong to him, what does that mean? And he hears this message in this place between when God promised and the place of fulfillment. And I'm going to kind of pick up right in the middle of chapter 17. I want to look at just a couple of verses with you. They actually set up what happens in chapter 18. Look with me at verse 17. So God's just said, I'm going to be your God, and I'm going to give you descendants, and to your descendants I'm going to give this land. And it says, Abraham, verse 17, fell face down. He laughed to himself. Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abram said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. I picture Abraham here as sort of slapping his knee and just going, yeah, right. I mean, give me a break. Really? Am I, at this age, my wife, past childbearing, really? And he's just laughing to himself. And then verse 19 says, then God said, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. And the Hebrew word Isaac means he laughs. And so God's saying, okay, you laugh now, but I'm going to have the last laugh. Because here he is in this place between, the place where God promised and its fulfillment. And God showed up. He said, you are going to have a son. I am going to fulfill my promises. I am your God. You belong to me. And there's this interesting interplay where Abraham, even as he thinks about these things, laughs. And God says, oh yeah, well, I'll have the last laugh. Chapter 18. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, while he was still sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. Of course, in our minds, and apparently in Abraham's mind, is who are these 3 men? They're coming to meet Abram. He hurries out to meet them. He greets them. He welcomes the men. But there's a question at this point, who are these 3 men? Later we're going to see that they're either angels of the Lord or a manifestation of God himself. But at this point, both we as the reader and Abraham as the recipient of these visitors does not yet know. He said, If I've found favor in your eyes, my lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under the tree. Let me get you something to eat so that you can be refreshed, and then go on your way now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered, "do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 seahs of fine flour and knead it and bake some bread." Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice tender calf and gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "They are in the tent," he said. Then the Lord said, and now at this point there's a switch that's made here, because we're aware that these 3 visitors are either angels of God or the manifestation of God himself. We read here in verse 10, "Then the Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." And as we've been tracking through this story since Abram left his people, God has been continually saying, "You are going to have a son. You're going to have a son. You're going to have a son." He's slapping his knee and saying, "Yeah, right," and laughing to himself. But there's that promise again. And now it's by this time next year when I return, you're going to have a son. It says in the middle of verse 10, "Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already old and well advanced in years, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, 'After I am worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure?' So she hears this, she starts laughing. I mean, come on, get out of town. I mean, look at us, we're old, we can't have children. I mean, I passed the age of childbearing a long time ago. What are they saying?" She's laughing. Verse 13 says, "Then the Lord said to Abraham, 'Why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I am old?'" And then this verse, "Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." I like this next verse. "Sarah was afraid. So she lied and said, 'I did not laugh.' But he said, 'Yes, you did laugh.'" And the title of my message today is, "Yes, you did laugh." And I want to talk about what this means and why this is here. And in both cases, Abraham, when he hears this promise, at some point just chuckles to himself, "This can't be." And now Sarah, when she hears these words, she starts laughing. I mean, come on, give me a break. Is this really going to happen? I want you to look with me at chapter 21. Just turn there. Chapter 21, the first few verses, provide some resolution to this story, and I want to deal with these verses now as we go through the life of Abraham. In chapter 21, Isaac is finally born, and this is the description beginning in verse 1. "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac," and you remember what that name means. It means he laughs, "to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, 'God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me.' And she added, 'Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age.'" There's this picture of Sarah standing at the entrance to the tent, overhearing what God is saying. By this time next year, you'll have a son. And she just buckles over in laughter. And God turns to Abraham and says, "Why is your wife laughing? Is anything too hard for God? Is anything too hard for the Lord to do?" Sarah, nervous, anxious, says, "I didn't laugh." God turns and says, "Yes, you did laugh." Now, in order to really talk about what this passage is getting at, I want to try something. This past week, I spent a bunch of time reading philosophical journals about what makes something funny. And I got to tell you, the more you read about it in a philosophical journal, the less funny it gets. But I want to just spend some time talking about, just together with you, and I want you to put your thinking caps on, what makes something funny so that we laugh. And more or less what these philosophical journals say, what is it that makes something funny, kind of boils down to two ideas, which I want to think about with you. First in kind of a sterile philosophical way, but then I'll try and bring it home a little better than that. They say there's two big ideas, and the ideas in something humorous are this: incongruity and surprise. Those are two necessary elements for something to be funny. And what they mean